Japan in the early 900s was not a country in any sense that a modern traveller would recognise. It was a loose collection of provinces stitched together under an imperial system that had been copied almost line for line from Tang Dynasty China, roughly a century and a half earlier. The logic behind the borrowing was sound enough on paper. A centralised state, a professional bureaucracy, a census system, redistributed land, and an army conscripted from the peasant population, clean in theory, catastrophic in practice, and on the rugged, rain-soaked islands of Japan, it began unravelling almost from the moment the ink dried. The problem, more than anything else, was geography. Japan is not a country that submits easily to administration. Its interior is dominated by mountains, steep and forested and deeply inconvenient for anyone trying to move soldiers or collect taxes at speed. The coast is long and fractured. The provinces at the eastern and northern edges of Honshu, the main island, sat at distances from the imperial capital that might as well have been the edge of the known world. Nara was the first capital, and then in 794, the court relocated to Heiankyo, the city that would eventually be known to history as Kyoto. The move was made partly for spiritual reasons and partly to escape the suffocating political influence of the Buddhist monasteries in Nara, which had accumulated alarming quantities of land, wealth, and quiet power over the preceding generations. The court moved. The problems it was running from did not. They followed it west and settled in, patient and persist, waiting for the moment the elegant fiction of centralized imperial rule would finally collapse under its own weight. That moment was coming. It would just take another century or two to fully arrive. And when it did, the people who filled the vacuum would not be poets or priests. They would be men on horseback with bows across their backs and a very particular understanding of how the world actually worked. Out in the provinces, the conscript army system had been failing quietly for decades before anyone in the capital acknowledged it openly. The men drafted under it were farmers, pulled away from the rice paddies during the most labour, intensive months of the agricultural year, handed minimal training, given inadequate equipment, and sent to patrol frontier regions against the Amishi, the indigenous people of the northeast, who resisted imperial expansion with a ferocity and tactical intelligence that the court's administrators had consistently underestimated. Conscript soldiers who had no personal stake in the outcome of a distant frontier campaign made, predictably, unreliable soldiers. They deserted in significant numbers. They arrived without adequate weapons. They got sick in unfamiliar terrain and died before they ever saw combat. By 792, the imperial court had largely acknowledged what everyone in the provinces already knew and began moving away from universal conscription, shifting toward a different approach, one that would over the following 2 centuries produce something the court had never intended and could not entirely control. The new approach relied on men called conde, which translates roughly as stalwart youth. These were the sons of wealthy provincial landowners, men who could afford their own horses, their own weapons, their own equipment, and their own training regimens conducted on their own land. They fought in their own interest as much as the emperors. They were, in the most practical sense, a military class rooted in property and regional identity rather than in imperial obligation. The court had outsourced its security problem to the people best positioned to solve it, and in doing so, handed those people a quiet and accumulating authority that would take centuries to fully manifest, and that no one in the capital fully grasped until it was far too late to renegotiate the terms. What had begun as a practical solution to a budget and logistics problem was quietly becoming the foundation of an entirely new social order, one that would eventually turn the entire structure of Japanese civilization upside down and govern it for the better part of 1,000 years. The word samurai comes from a Japanese verb, saburao, meaning to serve or to attend upon someone of higher rank. In its earliest usage, it had nothing whatsoever to do with warfare. A samurai was simply a person who waited on a lord, un attendant, a household retainer, a member of a great family's staff who happened also to be capable in a fight. The word bushi, meaning warrior or military man, was actually the older and more purely martial term. Over time, the two words blurred and eventually fused in the popular imagination. But in those early centuries, the distinction carried real meaning. A samurai was defined first by whom he served, and only second by what he could do with a weapon. Loyalty was built into the word before violence ever was. And that ordering of priorities would echo through 1,000 years of Japanese history in ways both beautiful and devastating. What these early provincial warriors actually fought with bears almost no resemblance to the image the word samurai now conjures across the world. The iconic weapon of popular imagination is the curved sword, the katana, elegant and mirror, polished and lethal in the hands of a trained master. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, the weapon that defined the Japanese warrior was the bow. Mounted archery was the absolute core of elite military practice. A warrior on horseback drawing a long asymmetric bow at a full gallop represented the pinnacle of martial technology that the provincial clans had refined and perfected across generations of practice and inheritance. The combination of horsemanship and archery was precisely what separated a serious warrior household from an ordinary farming family that happened to own a sword. The sword existed, was certainly carried, and was certainly used when the moment demanded it, but it remained a secondary weapon, something a mounted archer reached for when the arrows were exhausted or the distance closed too fast for another shot. A tool of last resort rather than a primary identity. The armour of this period was equally practical, shaped entirely by function rather than ceremony or display. Early Japanese lamellar armour, built from small lacquered scales of leather or iron, laced together with cords of silk or toughened leather, was constructed specifically to allow a mounted archer the full range of motion needed to draw a heavy bow at speed while galloping across uneven ground. It was layered heavily across the shoulders and chest where strikes were most likely to land, flexible at the joints where mobility mattered most, and designed to be assembled and removed with reasonable efficiency in field conditions. It was working equipment made by craftsmen who understood that the man wearing it needed first to survive and move, rather than to look magnificent in a formal portrait. The families who excelled in this martial world began accumulating land, followers, and regional reputations across successive generations in the way that durable power always accumulates. Slowly, and then all at once, a warrior of proven skill and sound judgment would attract younger men willing to enter his service. His sons would inherit his reputation along with his rice fields and his contacts. His followers' sons would follow his sons in turn, carrying the obligations of their fathers forward into a new generation without ever being asked to formally renew them. Over 2 or 3 generations, what had begun as a practical arrangement born of frontier necessity became something far more structured, a network of loyalty, obligation, and mutual interest that looked less like a military unit and more like a living social institution with its own internal logic and its own capacity for perpetuation. These networks would harden, over the long decades, into the great warrior clans of Japanese history. 2 names above all others would come to define that process and the violent century it eventually produced. The Minamoto clan, known also as the Genji, spread their influence through the eastern provinces and built their reputation in the hard frontier country of the northeast, where the fighting was real and the rewards went to men who could actually deliver results. The Taira, known also as the Heike, established themselves closer to the capital and cultivated deep, careful ties with the court aristocracy, developing a more polished manner than their eastern counterparts, which turned out to be a genuine strategic advantage in a world where access to the imperial court determined everything that mattered. Both clans traced their origins to imperial princes who had been quietly removed from the line of succession and given family names as a way of reducing the enormous financial cost of maintaining an ever-expanding imperial household across generations. It was a ruthless piece of administrative logic dressed in the language of honor. The surplus princes became provincial lords. The provincial lords became warriors. The warriors became something the court would spend the next 4 centuries trying to control. manage, suppress, and redirect, and consistently failing at every attempt. None of this happened in a single dramatic moment with a clear beginning and a declared intention. The warrior class grew the way most durable and consequential institutions grow, gradually and practically and in direct response to problems that no one had planned for and no one was entirely prepared to solve. Shaped as much by mountain ranges and harvest failures and the movement of hostile peoples along the northern frontier as by any deliberate policy decision made in the capital. Out in the provinces, something was arriving that had no formal name yet, but had already begun developing its own internal logic, its own hierarchy of values, and its own quiet conviction that the sword, in the long run of things, would always matter more than the poem. For most of the Heian period, the imperial court at Heiankyo operated on a principle that might generously be described as elegant fiction. The empress sat at the center of everything in theory, divine by bloodline, supreme by tradition, surrounded by ritual and ceremony and a calendar of obligations so detailed it left very little room for anything as inconvenient as actual governing. The poetry was exquisite. The robes were layered in precisely the correct seasonal colors. The carriages were arranged in the exact order that protocol demanded. And behind all of it, real power had been quietly gathered by a single aristocratic family, the Fujiwara, who had over generations perfected the art of political survival through a mechanism so elegant it barely looked like what it was. They placed their daughters in the imperial household. They ensured that the next emperor was almost always a Fujiwara grandson, and they then governed on his behalf as regent while he was young, and as indispensable chief advisor once he reached adulthood. It was a system of enormous sophistication and almost no military muscle whatsoever, which meant it worked beautifully in calm weather and became deeply vulnerable the moment anyone with an army decided to ask inconvenient questions. Fujiwara no Michinaga, at his height in the early 11th century, composed a short poem comparing himself to the full moon. Nothing lacking, nothing hidden. He was not being poetic in the modest sense. 3 of his daughters had become empress consorts. His grandson occupied the throne. He never formally took the title of regent because he simply did not need the label. Power that obvious and that complete requires no announcement. But the Fujiwara system contained within its elegant machinery a structural weakness that became clearer as the 1100s approached. It depended entirely on producing the right daughters at the right moment and placing them in the right households. And it had a second vulnerability far harder to engineer around. It could not defend itself. The Fujiwara had no army. When problems arose that required something more forceful than a strongly worded imperial decree, someone had to be called, and that someone was increasingly drawn from the warrior clans that had been quietly building their power in the provinces for 2 centuries while the court was composing verses about autumn leaves. The Minamoto and the Taira had, by the mid-1100s, become established and formidable presences in the military landscape of Japan, and their origins were stranger and more ironic than their eventual power might suggest. Both clans traced their founding not to some ancient warrior chieftain or legendary frontier hero, but to imperial princes who had been removed from the line of succession and granted family names as an administrative convenience. The imperial household was expensive to maintain across generations. Surplus sons and their descendants represented a growing financial liability. The solution the court devised was to grant these princes surnames, most commonly Minamoto or Taira, and send them out into the provinces as administrators and military figures, where they could be useful without drawing on the imperial treasury indefinitely. It was a quietly ruthless piece of logic, the kind that sounds reasonable in a budget meeting and reshapes civilizations over the following centuries. The displaced princes adapted to provincial life with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but their descendants adapted thoroughly. Within 2 or 3 generations, what had begun as a bureaucratic demotion had become something else entirely. These families had land, followers, military skills, and regional identities that the court could not simply revoke because it had grown inconvenient. They had become, in the most meaningful sense, a new kind of Japanese institution, The Minamoto built their deepest roots in the Kanto Plain, the broad and productive agricultural region of eastern Honshu that centuries later would become the undisputed heartland of Japanese military power. Their strength lay in the hard frontier country of the northeast, where the fighting against the Emishi had been real and sustained, and had produced warriors of genuine and tested capability rather than ceremonial rank. Their culture was blunt, Eastern, and organized around the practical realities of men who had spent generations solving problems that could not be solved with poetry. The Taira, by contrast, had cultivated their position much closer to the capital, developing connections with the court aristocracy that gave them access to appointments, titles, and influence that their eastern rivals lacked. They had acquired a more polished manner, a courtlier vocabulary, and an understanding of how the capital's political machinery worked from the inside. In a world where proximity to the imperial court was still the primary source of legitimacy and formal authority, this gave them advantages that pure martial excellence could not replicate. The system of retired emperors, known as insei, added yet another layer of complication to an already intricate political landscape. Beginning in the late 11th century, several emperors had abdicated while still relatively young, formally passing the throne to a designated successor while continuing to exercise very real political influence from their new position in retirement. A retired emperor was no longer bound by the ceremonial constraints of the reigning position, which meant he could act more directly and more freely in political affairs than a sitting emperor could without violating the elaborate protocols that governed every aspect of imperial public life. What this produced in practical terms was a court with multiple competing centers of authority pulling simultaneously in different directions. The reigning emperor, the regent, the retired emperor, and the great aristocratic households all had interests that did not naturally align, and they were increasingly willing to deploy warriors to press those interests when the political process failed to produce the outcomes they wanted. The warriors who were called upon to settle these disputes did so with professional effectiveness and then waited, understandably, to see what they would receive in return. The relationship between the court and the warrior clans was becoming, slowly and without anyone quite declaring it, something very different from the straightforward service arrangement. It had nominally been, the court needed the warriors. The warriors were beginning to understand, with growing clarity, exactly how much the court needed them, and what that need was actually worth. The two great clans watched each other across the political landscape of mid-12th century Japan, with the particular attention of rivals who have not yet decided whether the other is an ally or an obstacle. That decision would not remain open much longer. The mechanisms of the Heian political order were grinding toward the moment when all the accumulated tensions, the competing retired emperors, the frustrated warrior clans, the aristocratic families who felt their positions threatened, would find their release not in a poem or a ceremony or a carefully arranged marriage, but in fire and drawn swords in the streets of the capital itself. The warrior clans had spent 2 centuries building themselves into instruments of enormous destructive and organizational power. The court, with the combination of desperation and short-sightedness that characterizes so many fateful decisions, was about to use those instruments to settle a family argument. What happened next would make the elegant world of Heian poetry feel like something from another age entirely, because in the most important sense, it was about to become exactly that. The Fujiwara at their cultural and political peak had produced something genuinely remarkable, a civilization of extraordinary aesthetic refinement, a court culture so sophisticated in its attention to beauty, seasonal feeling, and poetic sensibility that it generated works of literature. Most notably the tale of Genji, written by Lady Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century, that are still read and studied 1,000 years later. The world inside those palace walls was in many respects the most refined human environment that had yet existed in the Japanese islands, and the people who inhabited it were not naive about power or indifferent to politics. They were deeply, obsessively political in the way that people always become when the stakes of courtly competition are high enough and the arena is small enough. What they lacked, and what they had no particular mechanism for developing, was the capacity to translate political sophistication into military force. They could arrange marriages with extraordinary precision. They could navigate the Byzantine protocols of court rank with a fluency that left outsiders bewildered. They could write verses that captured the exact quality of autumn light falling on a garden pond. What they could not do, when the moment required it, was put armed men in the field and make them fight effectively for a defined objective. That incapacity, so long masked by the surface stability of the Fujiwara system, was about to be exposed in the most direct and unambiguous way available in the 12th century. Through violence, the warrior clans had not planned to inherit the political world of Heian Japan. They had been called in to serve it, to protect it, to solve its most embarrassing practical problems, and then return to the provinces when the emergency passed. But every time they were called in, they remained a little longer. Every time they solved a problem, they became a little more indispensable. Every time a court faction reached for military allies to gain advantage over a rival faction, the warriors who answered that call learned something new about the fragility of the world they were being asked to defend. And somewhere in the eastern provinces, in the Kanto plain, where the Minamoto roots ran deepest, a class of men who had been told for generations that their role was to serve was quietly beginning to wonder what it might mean to rule. The moment that changed everything arrived not with a declaration of war or a dramatic siege, but with a succession dispute, the kind of internal court quarrel that the Heian system had been producing and absorbing for centuries. This one it could not absorb. In 1156, the death of Emperor Toba exposed a fracture that had been developing beneath the surface of court politics for years. Two factions crystallized around competing claimants, one supporting the reigning Emperor Go, Shirakawa, and one supporting the retired Emperor Sutoku, who believed with considerable bitterness that he had been passed over unfairly and manipulated out of the position that was rightfully his. Both factions did what court factions in 12th century Japan did when they ran out of political options. They sent for warriors. Both sides called upon the great clans. Both sides offered rewards, titles, appointments, and the promise of imperial favour. Both sides sent armed men into the streets of Heiankyo, a city that had been designed for ceremony and poetry and the careful movement of lacquered carriages, not for the movement of mounted soldiers with drawn weapons. The conflict is known to history as the Hogan Rebellion, and while it lasted only a matter of days, its consequences reordered the political world of Japan in ways that nobody who started it had remotely intended. Taira no Kiyomori fought on the winning side, supporting Go, Shirakawa. So did Minamoto no Yoshitomo. The rebellion was suppressed with speed and finality. The losing faction was dealt with harshly, and for a brief and deceptive moment, the two great warrior clans stood together in the capital as joint victors, rewarded with rank and court favour and the satisfaction of having been useful to the right people at the right time. What the court apparently failed to notice, in its relief at having resolved the immediate crisis, was the lesson it had just demonstrated in front of everyone who was paying attention. Political disputes in Japan could now be resolved by armed force. The precedent, once established, could not be unestablished. The warriors had been let through the gate. The gate could not simply be closed again, and the situation declared returned to normal. Because normal had just been permanently redefined 3 years later. The lesson was reinforced with a violence and decisiveness that removed whatever ambiguity the Hogan Rebellion had left behind. In 1159, a conflict known as the Meiji Rebellion broke out between the two clans themselves, and the causes were exactly what the causes of such conflicts always are, beneath the surface political justifications. Resentment over appointments and rewards that had not been distributed as expected. Grievances about who controlled access to the retired Emperor Go, Shirakawa. The accumulated frustrations of powerful men who had risked their lives in the Hogan Rebellion and felt the compensation had not matched the risk. Minamoto no Yoshitomo moved against the Taira, while Kiyomori was away from the capital on a religious pilgrimage to a Shinto shrine, which was either excellent timing or a calculated exploitation of an opportunity. Possibly both. Yoshitomo seized the retired emperor, set fire to the Sanjo palace in the process, and for a brief window held the initiative with an aggression that suggested he had been planning the move longer than the immediate grievances required. Kiyomori returned from his pilgrimage faster than Yoshitomo had calculated, rallied his forces with a speed that reflected both personal authority and the depth of Taira organizational capacity, and crushed the Minamoto in fighting around the capital with a decisiveness that settled the question of clan dominance for the next 2 decades. Yoshitomo was killed while fleeing eastward. Most of the senior Minamoto leadership was either killed in the fighting or executed in the aftermath. The clan that had stood as one of the 2 great pillars of Japanese warrior power was broken, scattered, and apparently finished as a political force. The Taira stood alone, and Kiyomori, at the height of his power and confidence, made a decision that would define the rest of his life and unmake everything he had built. He chose not to kill the children. Yoshitomo had sons, several of them, ranging from adolescence down to early childhood. By the logic of the period, by the accumulated precedent of how victorious clans dealt with the offspring of defeated rivals, they should have been executed. A surviving son was a surviving threat, a potential rallying point for anyone who wanted to oppose Taira dominance in the years ahead. Kiyomori apparently reasoned that they were children, that children were not worth the moral cost of killing, and that exile to distant provinces was a sufficient precaution. He sent them away rather than to their graves, and in doing so, committed what history would record as one of the most consequential acts of misplaced mercy ever documented. The eldest surviving son of significance was a boy named Yoritomo, sent into provincial exile in the Izu Peninsula in the east. Another was a younger son named Yoshitsune, whose later fate would become one of the most celebrated and heartbreaking stories in the entire samurai tradition. Kiyomori looked at these children and saw manageable inconveniences. History looked at them and saw the instruments of everything that was about to follow. The decision that looks reasonable in the moment and catastrophic in retrospect is one of the recurring patterns of powerful men throughout history, and Kiyomori provided perhaps its most perfectly documented example. The children grew up in exile. They were watched, controlled, restricted in their movements and their connections. They were not, however, prevented from thinking, from observing, from absorbing the lessons of what had destroyed their father, and from nurturing, across the slow years of provincial obscurity, a very specific and very patient sense of what they intended to do about it when the opportunity finally arrived. With the Minamoto broken and their children safely exiled, Taira no Kiyomori moved into a position of dominance at the Heian court that no warrior had ever previously occupied, or perhaps even imagined occupying. He accumulated titles and formal offices with a speed that must have made the old aristocratic families feel as though the floor of their carefully ordered world had begun to tilt beneath their feet. He became a senior counselor, then a minister, and in 1167 he was appointed Daijo, Daiyin, Grand Chancellor of the realm, the highest civil office in the imperial government. He was the first warrior in Japanese history to hold that position, which had for centuries been reserved exclusively for men of the most refined aristocratic lineage, men who had spent their careers in the careful cultivation of court culture, classical learning, and the performance of ceremonial obligation. The court families noted this appointment with the kind of quiet, carefully masked horror that people of established background reserve for anyone they consider an outsider ascending to places they did not earn through birth. They bowed to him in public. In private, they did not forget what he was. The distinction between public deference and private contempt is one that powerful outsiders in every culture and every era have had to navigate. And Kiyomori navigated it with a bluntness that suggested he was aware of the contempt and had decided he could afford to ignore it. At least for now, what he could not afford to ignore, and what no amount of accumulated court title could fully address, was the question of what happened when all the people who resented his rise decided that their resentment was worth acting upon. That question was already forming in the provinces, in the Buddhist monasteries, in the households of dispossessed lords, and in the distant eastern estate where a boy named Yoritomo was becoming a man with a very long memory and a very clear sense of purpose. The wolf was in the court now, wearing the robes of a grand chancellor and arranging his daughter's marriages into the imperial household. What no one yet understood was that other wolves were being raised in the east, patient and quiet, and fed on years of accumulated grievance, waiting for the moment when the gate might open again. The court had called the warrior clans in to settle a family argument, and the warrior clans had settled it with the efficiency that warriors bring to every problem they are handed. What the court had not accounted for, in its elegant and short-sighted calculation, was that warriors who are called in to solve problems do not simply return to the countryside once the problem is resolved. They stay, they watch, they learn the shape of the machinery they have been invited into, and they begin to understand, with a practical intelligence that court culture rarely produced, exactly where the weak points are and exactly what it would take to press on them. The Hogen and Heiji rebellions were not just military conflicts, they were tutorials, conducted at the expense of the participants. In the true nature of power in 12th century Japan, the Taira had passed the tutorial with the highest available marks. The surviving Minamoto children, growing up in their provincial exile with nothing to do but think, were taking the same course by correspondence. The exam would come, and when it did, the results would be recorded not in court documents or poetic anthologies, but in the names of battles that the Japanese would still be recounting 1,000 years later. Taira no Kiyomori did not simply enter the Heian court, he consumed it. In the years following the Heiji rebellion, he moved through the aristocratic world of Heiankyo with the methodical confidence of a man who had fought his way to the top of a system that had never been designed to accommodate someone like him, and who had decided that the system's discomfort was the system's problem rather than his own. The appointments flowed to Taira allies. The estates and income rights that had supported court families and provincial lords for generations were reassigned to Taira loyalists with a speed that left the dispossessed scrambling for alternatives they did not have. Senior positions in the imperial bureaucracy, offices that families had held for generations as a matter of hereditary right, were filled with Taira men or with figures whose loyalty to Kiyomori was the primary qualification for the role. The capital filled with Taira supporters, relatives, and dependents until the ordinary business of moving through Heiankyo meant navigating a city that had been remade in a single clan's image. The court aristocrats who had survived the political transition watched all of this with the carefully composed expressions of people who understood that visible displeasure was dangerous and that invisible displeasure was the only kind currently available to them. They composed verses, they attended ceremonies, they arranged their robes in the correct seasonal colours and appeared at the correct ritual occasions and said nothing that could be reported to Kiyomori's people. Beneath the surface, the rosette spreading outward from the capital through the provincial networks, finding willing audiences among displaced lords, frustrated warriors, and Buddhist institutions that had their own long histories of political grievance and their own, occasionally armed, opinions about who should be governing Japan. Kiyomori's political achievement in these years was, by any honest measure, genuinely remarkable. He had replicated the entire Fujiwara playbook, the strategic placement of daughters in the imperial household, the cultivation of regent, like authority over a sitting emperor, the accumulation of titles and offices that gave administrative control over the machinery of government. But he had accomplished it in roughly 15 years rather than the multiple generations the Fujiwara had required. His daughter Tokuko became the consort of Emperor Takakura, and in 1178, she gave birth to a son who would become Emperor Antoku. Kiyomori could look at the child on the imperial throne and identify him as his own grandson, which was precisely what the Fujiwara had always arranged for themselves and precisely what they had always used to justify their grip on power. The irony was not lost on the old aristocratic families, who found themselves outmaneuvered by a warrior using their own strategy. The difference, the one that the courtiers never forgot even when they were bowing to him, was that Kiyomori had arrived at his position through military power rather than through the gradual, multi-generational accumulation of court precedent and bloodline connection. He was still, at the bottom of everything, a warrior, and the world he was trying to inhabit had been built by and for people who regarded warriors as necessary instruments rather than legitimate members of the governing class. He sat in the Grand Chancellor's seat, and the seat held him correctly enough in physical terms, but the people around him never quite adjusted to the sight of him in it, and their inability to adjust would prove, over time, to be one of the forces that destroyed him. The overreach began almost as soon as the dominance was established, which is the pattern that overreach tends to follow in the careers of people who rise very fast to very great heights. Kiyomori grew less cautious as his position solidified, and the visible opposition shrank to whispers in private rooms. In 1180, he moved the capital briefly to a new site on the western coast at Fukuhara, near what is now Kobe, a decision that generated enormous disruption throughout the court, forced the movement of the entire imperial apparatus to an undeveloped location, and was reversed within months when the practical difficulties proved insurmountable and the political costs too large to justify the original rationale. The episode damaged his reputation for sound judgment in ways that previous successes had not fully protected him against. He humiliated retired emperors who opposed his policies, treating men whose nominal spiritual authority remained real in the imagination of the court with a directness that bordered on contempt. When a plot against him was discovered in 1179, his response was not subtle. He removed over 40 court officials from their positions in a single day, an act so blunt and so sweeping that even figures who had been willing to accommodate his rise began privately reconsidering the calculations that had led them to that accommodation. A political system that had survived for centuries on the careful management of face, on the preservation of the forms of dignity even when the substance of power had been transferred, was being administered by a man who had limited patience for the forms and even less for the people who insisted on them. The coalition of opposition that was forming in response was not organized, had no central leadership, and operated without any shared plan. What it had was a shared grievance deep enough to override the differences of interest and geography that would otherwise have kept its members apart. Into this accumulating crisis, the voice that would change everything came from an unexpected source. In the 4th month of 1180, a prince of the imperial family named Mochihito, who had been passed over for the throne and had spent years nursing the specific bitterness of a man who believes he was robbed of something that was rightfully his, issued a call to arms directed at the Minamoto clan and any other warrior family willing to take the field against the Taira. The document was technically treasonous, issued without the authority to issue it, and the Taira discovered it and moved against its author almost immediately. Mochihito was killed within weeks of the call going out, but the document had already been copied and distributed, carried east and north by messengers whose speed outran the Taira's ability to intercept them, and its contents mattered infinitely more than the fate of the man who had written it. It provided the Minamoto and their potential allies with something that pure military power could not manufacture on its own, an imperial mandate, or something that could be presented as one, a claim to legitimacy rooted in the imperial family's own authority, rather than in the ambitions of a defeated clan seeking revenge. In a political culture where the source of authority was still, despite everything, ultimately traced back to the throne, that piece of paper was worth more than its physical weight in warriors. Kiyomori himself would not live to see what it set in motion. He died in the 2nd month of 1180. 1. Consumed by a fever so severe that those around him claimed his body radiated heat like iron pulled from a forge. He had spent his final months watching the war he had always feared begin to assemble itself around the edges of the empire he had constructed, and he died knowing that the children he had chosen to spare rather than execute were somewhere in the eastern provinces. Reading that document and making their plans, the dragon had burned brilliantly across the sky of Heian Japan. Now the sky was filling with smoke from a different direction entirely, and the men carrying the fire had Minamoto blood and 20 years of patient, carefully nurtured, absolutely focused rage to fuel it. The call to arms that Prince Mochihito had issued before his death reached Minamoto no Yoritomo in the eastern province of Izu, where he had spent the previous 20 years living under provincial supervision in conditions that were not quite imprisonment and not quite freedom, occupying the uncomfortable space between those two states that political exiles throughout history have known well. He was in his early 30s by the time the document arrived, steady in temperament where his father Yoshitomo had been impulsive, methodical where others rushed forward on the energy of immediate emotion. The years of enforced provincial obscurity had not broken him. If anything, they had sharpened him, giving him time to observe the political landscape with the unhurried attention of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing to do but think carefully about the world and his place in it. He had built quiet connections with local warrior families in the Kanto region during those 2 decades, relationships that were technically the casual socializing of a supervised exile, but were functionally the foundation of a political network. He had apparently spent considerable time thinking about what he would do if an opportunity presented itself. The opportunity had now arrived in the form of a dead prince's document, and Yoritomo moved with the kind of measured decisiveness that can only come from a man who has been rehearsing his response for years without knowing exactly when the rehearsal would end and the performance begin. His first attempt did not go well. Moving too quickly with insufficient forces, he was defeated at the Battle of Ishibashiyama in the 8th month of 1180 and forced to flee into the wooded mountains with a handful of loyal followers, hiding in a hollow tree, according to one account that has the quality of a story too perfectly symbolic to have been invented after the fact. The defeat was genuine and the danger was real, but it was also temporary in a way that the Taira forces pursuing him apparently did not fully appreciate. The eastern provinces, the broad Kanto plain where Minamoto influence ran deepest through generations of family connection and martial reputation, rallied to Yoritomo with a speed that revealed just how thin and how unloved Taira administration of the region had become. Within months of Ishibashiyama, he had assembled a substantial force, established his base at Kamakura on the eastern coast, a location chosen with an eye for both defensibility and symbolic distance from the capital he had no intention of entering prematurely, and begun the careful organizational work of converting a regional uprising into something with the structure, the discipline, and the staying power to fight a war that might last years rather than weeks. Kamakura was not chosen casually. It was a coastal location backed by hills on 3 sides, difficult to approach in force and easy to defend. Positioned in the heart of the territory where Yoritomo's support was strongest and the Taira's reach was weakest, the decision to govern from there, to build his administrative machinery in the east, rather than rushing toward the capital as a lesser or more impatient man might have done, was one of the most consequential choices of the entire Genpei War before the first major battle had even been fought. The Taira, meanwhile, were discovering the difference between controlling the capital and controlling the country, a distinction that looks obvious in retrospect and tends to surprise every centralized power that encounters it. Their strength was concentrated in the court apparatus and in the western provinces where their family connections ran deep. The further east you travelled, the thinner their actual authority became, a fact they had managed comfortably enough during peacetime when nobody was testing the edges, and catastrophically badly once someone was. They sent armies eastward. Those armies achieved no decisive results, partly because the geography of the Kanto favoured defenders who knew the terrain, partly because Yoritomo was disciplined enough not to rush a confrontation he did not need to force. He was consolidating, recruiting, and waiting for the Taira to extend themselves onto ground he had chosen, rather than ground they had chosen for him. The war grew significantly more complicated in 1180, 2 and 1180, 3 when a second Minamoto force emerged from an entirely different direction. This one came from the northern provinces under the command of Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a cousin of Yoritomo, who was fierce and effective on the battlefield and considerably more difficult to work with than his military reputation had led anyone to hope. Yoshinaka pushed south and west through central Japan with a force and a speed that the Taira had not anticipated from that direction, driving them back toward the capital with a momentum that seemed, for a brief period, unstoppable. In the 7th month of 1183, the Taira made the decision that more than any other single action defined the remainder of the war. They abandoned Heiankyo, the entire Taira leadership, along with the young Emperor Antoku, who was 6 years old, and the imperial regalia, the sacred sword, the mirror, and the jewel that constituted the physical and spiritual symbols of imperial legitimacy, moved west out of the capital and toward the sea, where the Taira naval strength offered a kind of security that the land war was no longer providing. The removal of the emperor and the regalia was not merely logistical. It was a profound political act, a declaration that the legitimate imperial court was wherever the Taira said it was, and that the court left behind in Heiankyo was a construction without the sacred objects that made it real. Yoshinaka entered the city in triumph, which was precisely when his problems began in earnest. His troops, drawn from the rough northern provinces and exhausted by months of hard campaigning, treated Heiankyo and its inhabitants with the casual disregard that military forces throughout history have shown toward civilian populations when the discipline holding them in check relaxes. The court aristocrats who had endured Taira dominance and hoped that a change of military masters might bring relief found themselves dealing instead with a different set of difficulties. Yoshinaka's political skills were not equal to his battlefield skills, a disproportion that is genuinely common among military figures of exceptional tactical ability and genuinely catastrophic when the political environment requires both in equal measure. His relationship with Yoritomo deteriorated rapidly, complicated by questions of authority, reward, and the fundamental incompatibility of two men who both believed they should be directing the Minamoto campaign. By early 1184, Yoshinaka had managed the considerable achievement of making nearly everyone in the capital want him removed, which was exactly the consensus Yoritomo needed to justify sending forces west under his younger brothers Noriori and Yoshitsune, the youngest of the spared sons, now in his mid-20s and developing a reputation as a military commander of unusual speed, tactical creativity, and an apparent indifference to the conventional limits of what was considered possible. Yoshinaka was defeated and killed in the first month of 1184. His removal consolidated Minamoto command of the entire campaign under Yoritomo's direction from Kamakura, which was almost certainly the outcome Yoritomo had been working toward from the moment his cousin had first emerged as an independent force. The war now entered its final phase, and this phase belonged almost entirely to Yoshitsune. At the Battle of Tani in the second month of 1184, the Taira had established a fortified position along the coast west of the capital, mountains rising steeply behind them and the sea open in front, a position that looked from the conventional military perspective essentially unassailable from the land side. Yoshitsune led a force down the near, vertical mountainside behind the Taira position, descending terrain that the defenders had considered physically impossible for a military force to traverse, and struck from a direction that nobody had prepared to defend. The Taira position collapsed. Survivors fled to their ships and retreated further west, carrying the child emperor and his regalia with them into the waters of the inland sea, where the Taira naval experience gave them an advantage that the Minamoto had not yet figured out how to overcome. The war was not finished, but the direction it was travelling had become, for anyone paying honest attention, unmistakably clear. The Taira had become a maritime power by necessity rather than by preference. Their strength had always been political, rooted in court connections and the careful cultivation of aristocratic relationships built across generations of careful manoeuvring in the corridors of Heiankyo. The sea was not their natural element, but with the land war lost and the capital abandoned, the inland sea offered something the Taira desperately needed in the winter of 1184 and the months that followed space: maneuverability, and the advantage of fighting on water where their experienced sailors and their knowledge of the tides and currents of those particular straits gave them capabilities that their Minamoto pursuers could not easily replicate. They moved westward along the coast, controlling the islands and the straits, maintaining the fiction of a legitimate imperial court wherever they anchored, because the child Emperor Antoku was with them, and the sacred regalia was with him. And as long as those two facts remained true, the Taira could argue that the court in Heiankyo was the illegitimate one, and their floating court on the Western Sea was the real centre of Japanese imperial authority. It was a claim of diminishing persuasiveness as their military situation deteriorated. But it was not without logic, and they pressed it with the persistence of people who understood that legitimacy was the last card they had left to play. Yoshitsune had struck at Yashima on the northern coast of Shikoku in the first month of 1180. 5. Crossing from the mainland in stormy conditions that the Taira lookouts had judged prohibitive for a military crossing, and therefore had not positioned forces to defend against. The attack succeeded in driving the Taira fleet from Shikoku and forcing them further west toward the narrow strait at the western tip of Honshu, where the inland sea opened into the broader waters of the ocean beyond. The Taira were running out of sea. The final battle was now a matter of geography as much as military decision. There was nowhere left to retreat toward, and the Minamoto fleet was closing from the east. On the 24th day of the third month of 1180, 5. The two fleets met at Dan. No, Ura, a strait of fast. Moving water at the westernmost tip of Honshu, where the tidal currents run strong and the channel narrows between the main island and the northern shore of Kyushu. The Taira deployed with the tidal current in their favour in the opening phase of the battle, which gave their fleet an initial positional advantage that the Minamoto commanders could not immediately overcome. For a period in the early fighting, the Taira seemed to be holding. Their ships were well positioned. Their archers were effective. The numbers were not grossly unequal. And then something happened that the Taira commanders had not anticipated and could not reverse. Several of the Allied commanders who had been fighting under the Taira banner switched sides during the battle itself, crossing to the Minamoto fleet while the fighting was still ongoing. Defection in the middle of an engagement is one of the most psychologically devastating events that can occur in a military force, because it does not merely reduce the numbers, it destroys the trust between every unit that remains, making each commander uncertain whether the ships beside him will still be there in the next hour. More critically, the defecting commanders carried with them knowledge that the Minamoto desperately needed and had not been able to obtain through any other means. They knew which ships were carrying the Emperor and the regalia. In a sea battle involving hundreds of vessels spread across a tidal strait, that information was decisive. The Minamoto could now direct their attack with precision rather than fighting blindly across the entire fleet, and they did so with a focused intensity that collapsed the Taira formation in the battle's final phase. The engagement that followed was swift and overwhelming, and final in a way that left no room for negotiation or partial outcomes. The Taira, understanding with the clarity that comes in the last moments of an irreversible defeat that everything they had fought to preserve was finished, began making their final choices. Those choices, recorded and retold in the chronicles and epic poetry that the Genpei War generated across the following centuries, have the quality of scenes from a tragedy that everyone watching knows cannot end any other way and cannot look away from regardless. Senior Taira commanders threw themselves into the sea rather than surrender to the men who had hunted them across half of Japan. Taira no Tomomori, one of the most capable military commanders the clan had produced, is said to have put on a second suit of armour over the first, adding the weight deliberately so that he would sink quickly and certainly, and walked off the side of his ship into the strait. The women of the Taira court, the ladies who had followed their clan into exile and across the sea, with the composure that court culture demanded, even in circumstances it had never anticipated, followed their lords into the water. And then there was the child emperor. Antoku was 7 years old. He had been emperor since the age of 2, had grown up in the extraordinary circumstances of a court in flight, carried from the capital to the western shore and out onto the sea, and he understood, in whatever way a 7-year-old understands the world he inhabits, that something final was happening around him. His grandmother, Ni Dono, the widow of Taira no Kiyomori, and one of the formidable women of the era, took him in her arms. She told him, according to the account preserved in the tale of the Heike, that beneath the waves was another pure land, another capital, as clean and as peaceful as the one they had lost. Then she walked into the sea carrying him, and the water closed over them both. The loss of the emperor was a catastrophe of a specific and irreplaceable kind, but the loss that accompanied it was in some respects even more practically significant for the political world that survived the battle. 2 of the 3 imperial regalia, the sacred sword Kusanagi and the jewel Yasakani no Magatama, sank with the Taira into the strait at Dan. No, Ura, the mirror was recovered from the water. The sword and the jewel were gone to the bottom of the sea, lost in depths that no recovery effort of the period could reach. The imperial regalia were not merely symbolic objects in the abstract sense that national symbols tend to be. They were the physical proof of legitimate imperial authority, the objects whose possession constituted the reality of imperial rule rather than just its performance. An emperor without the regalia occupied a position of genuine theological and political ambiguity that the court had no established procedure for resolving. Because no one had designed a procedure for an outcome, this complete and this final, the court quietly produced replacement objects and did not discuss the matter at length in official documentation, which is the institutional equivalent of hoping nobody notices. Applied to the loss of the sacred foundations of imperial legitimacy, the Genpei War ended at Dan. No, Ura, with the Taira clan destroyed as a political force so completely that the destruction felt less like a military defeat and more like an erasure. What the battle established beyond its immediate military outcome was a principle that would govern Japanese politics for the next 7 centuries without interruption. Armed power, properly organized and ruthlessly applied, could override every other form of authority that the old court system had recognized or could generate. The poetry was finished. The age of the sword had fully, finally, and irrevocably begun. And the man waiting in Kamakura already knew exactly what he intended to build from the wreckage. Yoritomo never went to the capital. This was not an oversight, not a logistical delay, not the result of competing priorities pulling his attention elsewhere. It was a decision, made deliberately and maintained consistently across the years of the Genpei War and the decades that followed. And it was perhaps the single most consequential strategic choice in the entire history of Japanese governance. While his brothers were leading campaigns across western Japan, while Yoshitsune was descending impossible cliffs and crossing stormy straits and winning the battles that would make his name immortal in Japanese cultural memory, Yoritomo stayed in Kamakura. He managed correspondence. He received oaths of personal loyalty from provincial warriors who came east to pledge themselves to him. He built the administrative machinery of a government that did not yet officially exist and had not yet been asked for by anyone with the formal authority to request it. When the war ended at Dan, no, Ura, he did not ride into Heiankyo in triumph wearing his victory like a declaration. He sent representatives. He accepted honours through intermediaries. He remained in the east, surrounded by the warrior families whose loyalty he had spent years carefully cultivating. And he governed Japan from a coastal town that the old court aristocracy regarded as a provincial backwater, which was precisely how he wanted them to regard it. The decision was not modesty. It was architecture. Yoritomo had watched what happened to the Taira with the attention of a man who intended to learn from their mistakes rather than repeat them with better military resources. The Taira had entered the court, absorbed its culture, arranged marriages into the imperial family, accumulated the titles and offices of the aristocratic world, and in doing so had made themselves vulnerable to everything the court contained: its factions, its ceremonial obligations, its capacity for generating resentment in the people it excluded, and its historical tendency to absorb powerful outsiders and eventually, through the slow pressure of its own logic, digest them into something the court could manage. Yoritomo had no intention of being digested. His government would exist alongside the imperial court, would nominally serve it, would preserve its forms and honour its rituals, but would do so from a safe geographic and psychological distance that the court could not bridge without his permission. The administrative system he constructed at Kamakura drew on practices that had been developing informally among warrior clans for generations, but formalized and extended them into something genuinely without precedent in Japanese history. His core constituency was the Gokunin, the housemen, direct vassals who had pledged personal loyalty to Yoritomo in exchange for his protection of their land rights and his recognition of their positions against rivals who might otherwise challenge them. The Gokunin system was bilateral in a way that the old imperial administrative relationships had not been. Each relationship was individually negotiated, personally maintained, and contingent on mutual performance. Yoritomo protected his vassals served him. The relationship was enforced not by bureaucratic procedure or imperial decree, but by the personal bond between a lord and the men who had looked him in the eye and pledged their lives to his cause. To extend that authority across the country without moving from Kamakura, Yoritomo established two new categories of official that the imperial system had never created or imagined needing. Shugo, military governors, were appointed to each province with responsibility for maintaining order, commanding military forces in their territories when needed, and overseeing the Gokunin networks within their jurisdictions. Yito, land stewards, were placed on individual estates, including estates that still nominally belonged to court families and Buddhist institutions. With authority over local administration and the collection of revenues, the Jito appointments were particularly significant because they inserted Kamakura's men into the economic life of the country at the most granular level available, giving the new warrior government a physical presence and a financial stake in lands that had previously operated entirely outside warrior administrative reach. The old court had governed Japan from a comfortable distance. Yoritomo's government would govern it from inside every productive estate in the country, which was a fundamentally different proposition and one that the court families understood, with growing unease, was not reversible through any mechanism they possessed. The imperial court in Heiankyo was not dismantled. The emperor continued to reign. Aristocrats continued to hold their titles and receive their stipends and compose their seasonal poetry and arrange their carriages in the correct ceremonial order, with the attention to protocol that centuries of practice had made second. Nature. What changed? So gradually that no single moment announced the transformation, was that the things the court had always controlled, appointments to provincial offices, land rights, the adjudication of property disputes between competing claimants, now required Kamakura's approval to mean anything in the world where actual people lived and actual rice was harvested and actual disputes were settled. The imperial government retained every one of its traditional forms while losing, one function at a time, the substance that the forms had always housed. It was a transition of remarkable political elegance, because it gave nobody a clear moment to point to and say that this was when things changed beyond recovery, which meant that nobody with an interest in the old order had a clear moment at which to mount a resistance that might have been effective. Yoritomo received the title of Sei, Itai Shogun, Great Barbarian, Subduing General, from the imperial court in 1190. 2. The title had ancient origins, but an entirely new meaning in the context of what Yoritomo had built. The government of the shogun, called the bakufu, or tent government, would remain the real center of Japanese political power for nearly 7 centuries, through 3 distinct shogunal dynasties and more changes of circumstance than anyone in 1190. 2 could have imagined surviving. There was, however, one piece of deeply personal and deeply revealing unfinished business that Yoritomo addressed in these years, and it illuminates his character more clearly than any of his administrative achievements. His younger brother Yoshitsune, the tactical genius who had delivered the military victories that made everything else possible, had accepted honours and appointments directly from the imperial court in Kyoto without routing them through Yoritomo's approval. The offence was procedural in its surface presentation and fundamental in its implications. Yoritomo's entire political system rested on the principle that all grants of authority flowed through him, that the chain of legitimacy ran from the imperial court to Yoritomo and from Yoritomo outward to everyone else. Yoshitsune had accepted a bypass of that chain, creating a precedent that, if allowed to stand, would undermine the logic on which everything Yoritomo had built depended. Whether Yoshitsune understood the full implications of what he had done is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that Yoritomo's response was to declare his brother an enemy of the Kamakura government and spend the following years hunting him across Japan with the same organizational thoroughness he had brought to every other problem he had decided to solve. Yoshitsune fled north and was sheltered for several years by a northern lord named Fujiwara no Hidehira, surviving in the far northeast while Kamakura pressure mounted steadily. When Hidehira died in 1187, his successor made the calculation that his guest was no longer an asset worth the cost of protecting, and turned on the man his father had sheltered. Yoshitsune died in the 4th month of 1189, taking his own life in a small hall in the northern provinces at the age of 30. 1. While his retainers held off the closing forces outside, the gap between military genius and political understanding had killed him, which is a pattern that repeats through history with enough regularity to qualify as something closer to a law than a coincidence. Yoritomo himself died in 1190. 9. Reportedly from injuries sustained when he fell from his horse at a bridge dedication ceremony. He was 50. 2. What he left behind was not just a victory or a title, but an institutional structure solid enough to continue functioning without the specific personality that had built it, which is the rarest and most meaningful measure of a political achievement, and the one that time alone can confirm. In the years after the Kamakura shogunate consolidated its authority over Japan, the country existed in a kind of structured isolation that its geography had always encouraged, and its politics had never found reason to disturb. Trade happened across the waters to the Korean peninsula and the Chinese coast. Buddhist monks carried ideas and texts back and forth with a regularity that kept Japanese religious and artistic culture connected to continental developments. Merchants moved goods through channels that were understood and accepted by everyone involved. But Japan had no powerful neighbours with obvious territorial ambitions toward the islands, and the surrounding sea provided a natural buffer that the population had never had much reason to think about as a vulnerability rather than simply a feature of the landscape they inhabited. That comfortable assumption changed in the 1260s when letters began arriving from the continent bearing a seal that represented something the Japanese islands had never previously encountered at close range. Kublai Khan was in the process of assembling the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen, extending and consolidating the conquests his grandfather Genghis Khan had initiated across Central Asia, China, and the Korean peninsula. He had brought the southern Song dynasty of China under Mongol control after a campaign that consumed decades and staggering quantities of men and resources. He had vassalized the Korean kingdom of Goryeo. He was directing military operations across Southeast Asia simultaneously, projecting power in multiple directions with the organizational capacity of an empire that had made the coordination of mass violence its primary institutional competence. The letter he sent to Japan in 1260, 8 was courteous in its phrasing and unambiguous in its meaning. Japan should acknowledge Mongol suzerainty, establish diplomatic relations, and begin paying tribute. The alternative was left to the recipient's imagination, though the imagination did not need to work especially hard, given the documented fate of every other kingdom that had received a similar invitation and declined it. The Kamakura shogunate was governed at this point by the regent Hojo Tokimune, who was 18 years old when the first letter arrived and who responded by not responding. Japan sent no reply. More letters came across the water in the following years, each one somewhat less courteous in tone than the one before it. Each one met with the same silence from Kamakura. Envoys arrived on Japanese shores and were turned away without the diplomatic reception that their status technically demanded. Tokimune's refusal to engage has been presented in Japanese historical tradition as an act of exceptional personal courage. The young regent, holding firm against the most powerful empire in the world through sheer force of will and conviction. It may well have been that. It is also possible that the shogunate was genuinely uncertain how to respond to a situation with no precedent in Japanese political experience, and that continued silence was easier than any of the available alternatives, none of which was particularly attractive. Eventually, Kublai Khan ran out of patience. As men who have been ignoring the letters of the most powerful ruler in the world for 5 consecutive years perhaps should have anticipated he would, the first invasion fleet assembled in Korea and launched in the 10th month of 1274, carrying a force estimated at somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 men drawn from Mongol, Chinese, and Korean contingents, transported on Korean, built ships across the Korea Strait toward the northwestern coast of Kyushu. They moved along the island chain off the coast, taking the islands of Tsushima and Iki with brutal efficiency before landing at Hakata Bay on the northern shore of Kyushu. What followed was one of the most disorienting military encounters in Japanese history, not because of who ultimately prevailed, but because of how completely the two sides' approaches to warfare failed to engage with each other in any way that either had prepared for Japanese warrior combat, as it had developed across the preceding 3 centuries, was built around individual performance and personal honor. Battles between Japanese forces typically began with formal declarations, with warriors identifying themselves and their lineage before engaging, and with single combat between named opponents carrying significant honor and practical importance within the warrior value system. The Mongol forces at Hakata Bay operated according to an entirely different logic that had nothing to do with individual honor and everything to do with collective tactical effectiveness. They fought in coordinated mass formations directed by signal drums and flags that allowed large units to maneuver simultaneously in response to changing conditions on the battlefield. They deployed weapons that Japanese warriors had simply never encountered in any form. Explosive projectiles that burst with noise and flame upon impact, creating confusion and injury across a radius rather than at a single point. Clouds of arrows from massed crossbowmen firing in coordinated volleys rather than as individual marksmen. A samurai riding forward to identify himself and challenge. A named opponent found himself facing an organized volley from dozens of archers who had no interest in his name or his lineage, and every interest in putting him on the ground as efficiently as possible. The Japanese defenders were pushed back from the beachhead and suffered significant casualties. The fighting was genuinely difficult in a way that the internal conflicts of the Genpei era had not prepared anyone for. Then during the night, for reasons that have been debated by historians ever since without reaching settled consensus, the Mongol fleet withdrew from the bay. A storm may have damaged the ships. The commanders may have assessed their supply situation as inadequate for a sustained inland campaign. The Korean sailors may have pressed for withdrawal given the deteriorating weather. Whatever the precise combination of factors, the fleet pulled back and eventually returned to Korea, leaving the Japanese to assess what had happened and prepare for what was clearly coming next. The shogunate understood with clarity what Hakata Bay had revealed. A stone defensive wall was constructed along the coast of the bay in the years between the 2 invasions. A straightforward piece of military engineering with no romantic quality whatsoever, and enormous practical value when the moment arrived that it was needed. The second invasion came in 1281, and it was considerably larger than anything the first expedition had represented. Kublai Khan assembled 2 separate forces, an eastern route army of roughly 40,000 men launching from Korea, and a Jiangnan army of perhaps 100,000 men drawn from the former southern Song territories launching from ports along the Chinese coast. The combined force represented one of the largest amphibious military operations in medieval history, a demonstration of Mongol imperial organizational capacity that left little room for comfortable assumptions about the outcome. The defensive wall along Hakata Bay slowed the Eastern Route Army's landing attempts with a practical effectiveness that converted the unglamorous engineering project of the previous years into one of the most important military investments in Japanese history. The fighting continued for weeks along the Kyushu coast, with the Japanese defenders holding the wall and the Mongol forces unable to establish the secure beachhead they needed to bring their full strength to bear on the campaign. Then, in the 7th month of 1280, A major typhoon struck Kyushu with a force and a timing that arrived precisely when the Mongol fleet was at its most exposed and its most vulnerable. Packed with soldiers who had not yet been landed and anchored in waters that offered inadequate shelter from a storm of that magnitude, the typhoon destroyed a substantial portion of the fleet and killed soldiers by the thousands. The invasion collapsed. The survivors withdrew. Kublai Khan's plans for a third attempt were eventually abandoned under the pressure of other military commitments and the sheer cost of 2 failed campaigns. The Japanese called the storm kamikaze, divine wind, and attributed its timing to the direct intervention of the gods who protected the islands. The belief settled deep into Japanese cultural and religious identity and would remain there across the following centuries, shaping how the Japanese understood their relationship with the divine and with the sea, with consequences that would eventually manifest in contexts far removed from the medieval Kyushu coastline where the original storms had blown. But the more immediate consequence of the Mongol invasions was quieter and slower, and ultimately more damaging to the Kamakura shogunate than any foreign fleet had managed to be. The warriors who had defended Kyushu expected rewards for their service. As the warrior system had always operated, there was no conquered territory to distribute, no captured estates to reassign, no spoils from a defensive war to pay the bills that loyalty had generated. The shogunate distributed what it could. It was not enough, and resentment, in a warrior culture, is a debt that compounds interest across generations. The Kamakura shogunate did not fall to a foreign invasion or a rival warrior clan or any of the forces that might have seemed. From the outside, most likely to bring it down, it fell to an emperor, Emperor Go. Daigo came to the throne in 1318 with a degree of personal political ambition that was unusual, in a position that had for generations been defined almost entirely by ceremonial passivity, and with a genuine and deeply held conviction that the arrangement of the previous century and a half, warrior clans governing while emperors reigned in comfortable and carefully maintained irrelevance, was a historical aberration that a sufficiently determined emperor ought to be able to correct through direct action. He was not wrong that the arrangement was historically unusual. Imperial rule had once meant something real and direct, and the memory of that reality had been preserved in the court's ceremonial forms, even as the substance drained away over the Kamakura decades. What Go? Daigo miscalculated, with a completeness that suggests he had been talking primarily to people who agreed with him, rather than people who understood the military landscape honestly, was his ability to reverse the arrangement by force in a world where the warrior class had been the actual governing power for 150 years and had no particular interest in returning to a supporting role. His first attempt at a coup against the shogunate in 1320, was discovered before it properly began, dismantled by Kamakura with the efficiency of an institution that had been managing internal threats for generations. His second attempt in 1330, one forced him to flee the capital and establish a rival court in the mountains of Yoshino to the south. The shogunate sent an army to suppress him, which it did effectively enough in military terms, but the campaign required extended deployment of forces in the south and west that left the shogunate's internal difficulties less attended to than a healthier institution could have afforded. The cracks that the Mongol invasion reward problem had opened in the loyalty of provincial warriors were still there, widening slowly beneath the surface of a system that looked more stable from the outside than it actually was from within. One of the commanders sent west to deal with Go. Daigo's supporters was a Minamoto descendant named Ashikaga Takuji, a lord of considerable military ability and considerably more political flexibility than the shogunate that had dispatched him had reason to expect. In 1333, rather than completing his assigned mission of suppression, Takuji switched sides, attacked the Kamakura government's headquarters in Kyoto, and opened the military and political door for Go. Daigo's return to power. Almost simultaneously, another commander attacked Kamakura itself. The last Hojo regent died in the fighting. The institution that had governed Japan for nearly a century and a half collapsed inside a matter of months with a speed that surprised nearly everyone, including the people who had been working toward its collapse. Go, Daigo returned to Kyoto in the summer of 1330. 3. And launched what became known as the Meiji Restoration, a genuine and energetic attempt to reimpose direct imperial governance across Japan, complete with land reassignments, new appointments distributed according to court precedent rather than warrior service, and the reorganization of administrative structures along lines that reflected the pre-warrior political world the emperor wanted to recreate, the warrior class, which had provided the military muscle that made the restoration possible, looked at these reforms with a mounting dissatisfaction that the emperor either did not notice or chose not to address. Rewards went to court aristocrats. Decisions that should have recognized warrior service recognized court precedent instead. The fundamental question of how an imperial government without a standing military force was going to enforce anything in a country saturated with armed men operating according to their own calculations of interest was left conspicuously and fatally unresolved. The Meiji Restoration lasted less than 3 years. Ashikaga Takauji resolved the unanswered question in 1330. 5. By raising his own forces against Daigo and driving him from the capital again, demonstrating in the process that the answer to how an imperial government without an army enforces its decisions in a country full of warriors is that it does not, and that the person with the largest and most loyal army makes the relevant decisions regardless of what the imperial court would prefer. Takauji established a new shogunate under his own family in 1330. 6. This one centered in the Muramachi district of Kyoto rather than in distant Kamakura, a choice that reflected the Ashikaga's closer relationship with the capital and their different political style compared to the Kamakura founders. Daigo, refusing with a stubbornness that history records with a mixture of admiration and exasperation to accept any outcome he had not chosen, established a rival southern court in the mountains of Yoshino and declared his imperial line the legitimate one. The Ashikaga backed a competing northern court in Kyoto. Japan now had 2 emperors simultaneously claiming legitimacy, a situation that created a theological and political difficulty that the country managed to sustain with varying degrees of discomfort for over 50 years before the southern court was finally persuaded to accept reunification in 1390. 2. The Ashikaga shogunate that emerged from this extended confusion was structurally weaker than its Kamakura predecessor from the very beginning, because the political deals Takauji had needed to make to assemble the coalition that defeated Daigo had required conceding significant autonomy to the regional lords who supported him. The Shugo, the provincial military governors who had been administrative appointees under the Kamakura system, had during the conflicts of the 1300s gradually converted what had been official positions into hereditary territorial power, becoming in practice regional rulers who acknowledged Ashikaga authority in name while governing their own domains largely as they saw fit. The third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu, managed the difficult task of reunifying the courts and brought the shogunate to the peak of its authority in the 1390s with genuine political skill and a cultural patronage that produced some of the most refined artistic achievements in Japanese history, including the development of Noh theatre and the construction of the famous Golden Pavilion in Kyoto. Later, shoguns found the machinery of central authority had been incrementally transferred to the lords around them during the periods when shogunal leadership was weak or distracted, until the gap between the title and the actual power it represented had grown too wide to bridge by ordinary political means. The collapse that finally ended the Ashikaga order was triggered by a succession dispute that engulfed the 2 most powerful warrior families in the country, the Hosokawa and the Yamana, pulling them onto opposing sides of a conflict over who would succeed the ailing shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa in the 1450s and early 1460s. The resulting war, known as the Onin War, began in 1467 and consisted primarily of extended and largely inconclusive fighting in and around the city of Kyoto for approximately a decade, at the end of which nothing of substance had been resolved. Roughly half the ancient capital had burned to the ground. Both of the primary commanders had died of natural causes during the fighting, and the shogunate's authority over the provinces had effectively ceased to exist as a practical reality. What followed was the period known as Sengoku, the Warring States, a century of near, constant warfare and political fragmentation during which central authority dissolved, and the Japanese concept of Gekkokujo, the low overcoming the high, became one of the defining social realities of the age. A constable's deputy could become a regional lord. A regional lord's most capable general could make himself a regional lord in his own right. A man born in a peasant household could, with sufficient military talent, strategic intelligence, and the ruthlessness to apply both without hesitation, end up governing a province and commanding the loyalty of men whose ancestors had ranked far above his own. The social fluidity was unprecedented in Japanese history. It produced a warrior class of different character than any that had come before, shaped by the specific competitive pressures of an age, when the only law that consistently applied was the one that said the strongest and cleverest man in the room would be making the decisions by morning, and that the strongest and cleverest man in the room could come from anywhere. Oda Nobunaga was born in 1530, in the province of Owari, a sized domain in central Honshu that had no particular distinction in the political landscape of Sengoku Japan, and no obvious reason to produce one of the most consequential and unsettling figures in the entire history of the Japanese islands. His father, Oda Nobunaga, was a capable minor lord who had expanded the family's position through a combination of effective small-scale warfare and shrewd alliance, but Owari remained a second-tier domain, and the Oda remained a second-tier family with no realistic claim to the kind of regional dominance that the great Sengoku daimyo were assembling in other parts of the country. Nobunaga's childhood reputation was, by every account that survives, genuinely alarming to the people responsible for him. He wandered the streets of his castle town eating food with his hands, wore his clothing half, fastened in a manner that violated every convention of proper warrior comportment, carried gourds of tea and food hanging from his belt like someone who could not be bothered to return home for meals, and associated freely and apparently happily with commoners in ways that scandalized the retainers, whose professional obligation it was to prepare him for lordship. They called him Owari no Outsuke, the Fool of Owari, and they meant it as an honest description rather than an affectionate nickname bestowed on a promising young eccentric. When his father died in 1551, and Nobunaga attended the funeral in his usual dishevelled state, arriving late and leaving early with food still in his hand, the senior retainers began reconsidering their employment options with genuine urgency. One of his own tutors, a man named Hirat Masahide, who had served the Oda family with distinguished loyalty, wrote a formal letter of protest about his young lord's behaviour and then killed himself to underline the seriousness of the point, which in retrospect seems like a remarkably extreme response to a teenager's apparent indifference to table manners, but which accurately reflects how completely Nobunaga's behaviour had violated the expectations of everyone around him. What the retainers had failed to observe beneath the deliberate casualness, the studied indifference to the performance of lordly dignity, was a young man who was paying extraordinarily close attention to everything around him, and had already formed some conclusions about the world that his contemporaries had not yet reached and would spend years catching up to. Nobunaga's apparent rejection of social convention was not incompetence, and it was not simple adolescent rebellion. It was, at least in substantial part, a calculated refusal to invest energy in the maintenance of appearances at the expense of the understanding of realities. The Sengoku period had been systematically dismantling the behavioural codes of the old warrior class for a century, and a lord who spent his resources performing the rituals of a social order that was actively collapsing around him was a lord making a bet that the evidence did not support. Nobunaga appears to have grasped this earlier and more completely than most of his contemporaries, and his willingness to simply ignore the performance while focusing on the substance was less a personality quirk than a strategic orientation that would define every significant decision of his career. His first major test came at the Battle of Okayazama in 1560, and it established the pattern with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. The powerful eastern lord Imagawa Yoshimoto was moving through Owari with a force estimated at somewhere between 5,000 and 5,000 men, heading toward Kyoto to intervene in the ongoing political confusion surrounding the remnants of the Ashikaga shogunate. Nobunaga's total available forces were a fraction of that number, and the rational response to being positioned between a massive army and its destination was to negotiate, concede territory, or simply clear the path and hope that the great lord passed through without deciding to absorb Owari while he was in the neighborhood. Nobunaga attacked instead. He moved a small, fast force to the narrow gorge at Okayazama, where Imagawa's army had paused to rest during a heavy rainstorm, struck directly at the command position, and killed Imagawa Yoshimoto in the initial assault. An army of tens of thousands collapsed and dispersed the moment its commander was gone, which demonstrated something that Nobunaga filed with care for future application, that concentrated force applied precisely at the correct point could defeat a much larger dispersed force, and that speed and surprise, properly coordinated, were worth more in the decisive moment than numerical parity measured in bodies. Portuguese traders had brought firearms to the southern island of Kyushu in 1543, and Japanese craftsmen had been copying and refining the design with impressive speed almost from the moment the first examples arrived. By the 1560s, firearms were not new in Japan, but their tactical deployment remained inconsistent and limited by a military culture that had not yet fully worked out what the weapons could do when organized systematically, rather than distributed individually among infantry units. As one element among many, the standard practice was to use arquebusiers as a supplementary force, their effectiveness constrained by loading time, weather conditions, and the general chaos of close quarters fighting that the Sengoku battlefield regularly produced. Nobunaga reorganized their use with a systematic intelligence that separated him from every other daimyo of the period who had access to the same weapons and had not yet understood what they could become. By the time of the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, fought against the Takeda clan, whose cavalry was considered the finest in Japan and whose reputation for battlefield ferocity had made them one of the dominant forces in the eastern provinces for a generation. Nobunaga had developed the practice of rotating volleys, with arquebusiers organized in lines and firing in sequence so that there was always a loaded weapon ready to discharge, while others in the rotation were reloading. The famous Takeda cavalry charged into layered volley fire delivered from behind defensive palisades and was effectively destroyed as a military force within the span of a single engagement. The Battle of Nagashino is cited as a decisive moment in Japanese military history, and while later scholarship has refined and complicated some details of the traditional account, the underlying reality it illustrates remains intact. Nobunaga was applying systematic organizational thinking to weapons technology, rather than using new tools according to the assumptions of the old tactical framework, which is the difference between improvement and transformation. In 1568, he entered Kyoto with military force, installing Ashikaga Yoshiaki as the new shogun in a move that gave his intervention a formal legitimacy it would otherwise have conspicuously lacked. He used Yoshiaki as a useful political instrument for several years, directing policy, while the shogunal seal provided the institutional cover that raw military power alone could not generate, until the relationship became more complicated than it was worth managing, and he expelled Yoshiaki from the capital in 1570. 3. The Ashikaga shogunate, which had been declining for a century through increasingly poor decisions and increasingly limited actual authority, ended not with a climactic battle or a formal declaration of dissolution, but with a shogun being asked to leave and having no means to refuse the request. In 1570, 1. Nobunaga surrounded and burned the Enryaku-ji monastery complex on Mount Hiei above Kyoto, killing a substantial portion of the resident population and destroying buildings that had stood for centuries. The great temples had maintained private armies, held vast landholdings, and operated as sovereign entities within the political landscape for generations. Nobunaga had no interest in accommodating institutional sovereignty that existed outside his control. Regardless of its religious character, the destruction horrified many people and was remembered across the following centuries in terms ranging from necessary ruthlessness to outright atrocity, depending entirely on the values of the person making the assessment. Then, on the 21st day of the 6th month of 1580, one of his own generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, turned his forces against Nobunaga while he was staying with a small personal retinue at the Hono Ji Temple in Kyoto. The reasons behind Mitsuhide's decision have been debated without settled conclusion ever since, with resentment over public humiliation, political calculation, and accumulated personal grievance all proposed as contributing factors. Surrounded and with no possibility of rescue or escape, Nobunaga set fire to the building and died inside it. He was 48 years old. The man who had spent his life burning the old world had, in the end, burned with it. Toyotomi Hideyoshi's origins were. By the standards of the warrior class, he would eventually come to dominate completely. Essentially non-existent, he was born around 1530, 7 in Owari, the same province that had produced Nobunaga, into a family of either peasants or very low, ranking foot soldiers depending on which source you consult, and the sources are inconsistent in ways that are themselves revealing, because Hideyoshi spent considerable effort in the later years of his life obscuring the details of his background. Once obscuring them became politically useful and socially necessary. A man who governs all of Japan cannot easily be identified as the son of a farmer, and the historical record reflects the pressure that inconvenient origins place on official biography. What is reasonably clear beneath the layers of later revision is that he had no samurai lineage, no inherited land, no family name worth mentioning, and no obvious starting point for the trajectory that would end, with him holding more power than any person in Japan had possessed since the early imperial period. One account, repeated so many times, it has acquired the durability of established fact regardless of its precise accuracy, describes his initial role in Nobunaga's service as carrying his lord's sandals, warming them inside his clothing before Nobunaga stepped into them on cold mornings. A detail of such perfect symbolic economy that it feels like something a storyteller would invent if history had not provided it. What elevated him from that starting point was ability, demonstrated consistently and across a remarkable range of domains over 2 decades of service. He showed administrative talent alongside military talent, a combination that made him unusually valuable to Nobunaga, who needed men who could manage a captured province as efficiently as they could take one. Governing territory in the Sengoku period required a different skill set than conquering it, and commanders who possessed both capacities in genuine measure were rare enough to be worth keeping close and rewarding generously. Nobunaga called him Saru, monkey, a nickname that referred to Hideyoshi's physical appearance, which contemporary accounts describe consistently as small, slight, and irregular in feature in ways that made him immediately recognizable in any gathering. Nobunaga was not known for sensitivity in these matters, and Hideyoshi had the useful quality of being more interested in what the nickname signified about his position than in being wounded by what it said about his face. When news of Nobunaga's death at Hono Ji reached Hideyoshi in the 6th month of 1580. He was conducting a siege in the western provinces against the Mori clan, one of the most powerful regional lords in western Japan, in a campaign that had been progressing steadily but had not yet reached its conclusion. He negotiated a ceasefire with the Mori with a speed that suggested extraordinary composure under pressure, apparently without informing them immediately of what had happened in Kyoto, which simplified the negotiation considerably since a Mori clan that knew Nobunaga was dead and the Oda political structure was in sudden crisis would have had much less reason to agree to any ceasefire on terms favourable to the Oda side. Then he moved his army back east toward the capital, at a pace that military historians still cite as remarkable for the period and the terrain involved. He covered roughly 200 li in under 2 weeks. Arriving in the Kyoto region while Akechi Mitsuhide was still in the process of consolidating his position and had not yet secured the political support that turning the assassination of a lord into a successful seizure of power required, Hideyoshi engaged Mitsuhide at the Battle of Yamazaki on the 2nd day of the 7th month of 1580. 2. The battle lasted approximately half a day. Mitsuhide was defeated decisively and died shortly afterward, reportedly killed by bandits while fleeing through the countryside. An ending so inglorious for a man who had just killed one of the great lords of the age that it has the quality of history making an editorial comment. The entire sequence from Nobunaga's death to Mitsuhide's end occupied 13 days, which tells you something specific and important about the difference between the man who planned the assassination and the man who responded to it. Hideyoshi then moved with the same speed to claim Nobunaga's political legacy. Understanding that the window between a great lord's death and the consolidation of successor authority is narrow, and that the person who moves fastest through that window tends to define the outcome for everyone else, he convened a council of senior Oda generals and family members at Kiyosu in the 7th month of 1580. 2. Where he successfully backed Nobunaga's young grandson as the nominal Oda heir, while positioning himself as the primary administrator of everything that mattered in practice. The more senior Oda generals who might credibly have challenged this arrangement found themselves sidelined through a combination of political pressure, carefully constructed alliance, building, and the simple, overwhelming fact that Hideyoshi had moved faster and more decisively than anyone else had managed to do. His main military challenge came from Shibata Katsui, one of Nobunaga's most experienced and respected generals, who allied with another Oda family claimant and contested Hideyoshi's primacy with the backing of a substantial military force. The conflict was settled at the Battle of Shizugatake in 1580. 3. Where Hideyoshi won with a decisiveness that removed the question of Oda succession from active debate. Katsui retreated to his castle at Kitanosho and set fire to it with his household inside rather than surrender, a choice that had a certain terrible finality to it, and that closed the last serious internal challenge to Hideyoshi's control of the Oda inheritance. There remained, however, one figure whose position could not be resolved through battle alone, or at least not through any battle whose cost would be worth the outcome. Tokugawa Ieyasu had been Nobunaga's ally of 2 decades standing, not his subordinate, and he did not regard the transition of power following Hono as automatically elevating the former sandal, bearer above the position of a man who had fought beside Nobunaga as an equal partner since 1560. In 1580, 4. The two men fought, or more precisely their armies spent several months in careful and largely inconclusive manoeuvring around Komaki and Nagakute, where Ieyasu demonstrated with quiet competence that he could not be easily defeated, and Hideyoshi demonstrated with equal clarity that defeating Ieyasu decisively would be expensive relative to any benefit the victory would generate. The conflict ended in a negotiated peace that preserved Ieyasu's autonomy in his eastern domains, while acknowledging Hideyoshi's overall primacy in the political landscape, and Ieyasu later formalized his acceptance by traveling to Osaka in 1580. 6. The two men reaching a working arrangement that both apparently understood was a truce of indefinite duration rather than a permanent settlement of their relative positions, by 1590, with the surrender of the Hojo clan in the east and the completion of campaigns in the northern provinces. Japan was effectively unified under Hideyoshi's authority for the first time in over a century. He issued the Katanagari, or Sword Hunt Edict of 1588, ordering the disarmament of warrior classes and requiring peasants, monks, and townspeople to surrender their weapons, which were collected and melted down for use in constructing a great Buddha statue, a piece of political communication so efficient it converted a social control measure into an act of simultaneous religious merit and practical disarmament. The Separation Edict of 1590. One formalized the division between warriors, farmers, and townspeople, restricting movement between social categories and requiring people to remain in the class their current occupation defined. The remarkable social mobility of the Sengoku period, the world in which a peasant could become a general and a general could become a lord, was officially and deliberately closed. Hideyoshi had risen through exactly that fluid world, and was now, having reached the top of it, pulling the ladder up behind him with the practicality of a man who understood that the same opening that had allowed him to rise would allow others to rise against him. He died in the 8th month of 1590. 8. Weeping over a 5-year old son named Hideyori, and extracting promises from the council of regents he had assembled that they would protect the boy's inheritance. With the clarity of a dying man who understood precisely how much those promises were worth in a world where armed power made the relevant decisions, and who wept because he understood it and could not change it, Tokugawa Ieyasu had been watching and waiting and building for most of his adult life, and the patience had accumulated across decades with the quiet, compounding force of something that knows exactly what it is waiting for and has decided that hurrying would ruin it. He had watched Nobunaga build an empire through force and organizational genius and die in 13 days because he trusted a general he should not have trusted. He had watched Hideyoshi rise from nothing to everything through speed and political cunning, and then spend his final years weeping over a child he could not protect. He had absorbed the lessons of both careers with the attentiveness of a man who intended to build something that would outlast him, which required understanding not just how to win, but how to make winning permanent in a way that neither of his predecessors had managed. The Battle of Sekigahara came on the 15th day of the 9th month of 1600, fought in a valley in central Japan where the roads from the east and west converged, and it lasted a single day. The outcome was decided partly by the quality of Ieyasu's military preparation and partly by the defection of several lords on the opposing side who had made private arrangements with him beforehand. Arrangements that reflected the depth and patience of the political work he had been conducting in the 2 years since Hideyoshi's death, while appearing to honour the Regency Council's authority. His coalition won with a decisiveness that left the opposing lords without the military foundation they would have needed to continue the contest. Ieyasu spent the following years redistributing domains across Japan with an architectural precision that went far beyond simple reward and punishment. Lords who had fought against him were reduced in territory or relocated to distant provinces, where rebuilding a political network capable of threatening Tokugawa authority would require generations of careful work under the constant observation of Tokugawa. Aligned neighbours, lords who had supported him, were rewarded, but placed in configurations that maintained their dependence on continued Tokugawa favour, rather than allowing them to build independent power bases that might eventually generate ambitions of their own. The landscape of Japanese lordship was redesigned from the ground up to make opposition structurally impractical, rather than merely politically difficult. He passed the title of shogun to his son Hidetada in 1605, just 2 years after receiving it himself, establishing by that single act the principle that the position was hereditary Tokugawa property, rather than a personal grant to an individual of demonstrated merit. The imperial court confirmed the transfer because the imperial court was not in a position to refuse, and because the arrangement preserved every ceremonial form that the court required while asking nothing of it that might have proved inconvenient. The Toyotomi problem required a separate and final resolution. Hideyori had grown to adulthood in Osaka Castle, and the castle and the young man it housed remained a focal point for everyone who wished to oppose Tokugawa authority under the politically useful banner of restoring the legitimate heir of Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Ieyasu found his pretext in 1614 through a dispute over an inscription on a bell cast for a new temple in Kyoto, a phrase in the dedication text that could be interpreted, with sufficient imagination and political motivation, as an oblique insult to the Tokugawa name and a prayer for their misfortune. The interpretation required considerable stretching, but Ieyasu had waited long enough and was old enough, approaching his 70s, to understand that the time for finding a pretext had arrived. The first siege of Osaka Castle in the winter of 1614 ended without a decisive military result and was settled through negotiation, during which Tokugawa forces filled in the outer defensive moats as a condition of the ceasefire agreement, When the outer moats were filled and the castle's defensive depth was correspondingly reduced, Ieyasu moved again in the summer of 1615 with a force that the castle's remaining defences could not repel. Hideyori died during the fall of the castle. With him went the last serious challenge to Tokugawa authority from within Japan, and the period of active, large, scale warfare that had defined Japanese life for the previous century and a half came to a close with a finality that no previous military victory in Japanese history had quite managed to achieve. What the Tokugawa shogunate constructed in the peace that followed was a social and political order designed with a single, overriding priority that shaped every mechanism and every institution it produced. The priority was permanence. The Sankin, Kotai system, formalized in the 1630s, required all daimyo to spend alternating years in the shogunal capital at Edo and at their home domains, a requirement that served simultaneously as a surveillance mechanism, a loyalty demonstration, and an enormous ongoing financial drain on the daimyo class. When a lord returned to his domain, his family remained in Edo as what everyone understood to be hostages, though the word was never used officially, maintaining two complete households, a formal Edo residence staffed and equipped to the standard that a lord's rank demanded, and the expensive processions required for the annual travel between the two consumed resources that might otherwise have funded the development of independent military capacity. It was a remarkably efficient mechanism for preventing rebellion without having to suppress it after the fact, and it had the additional and entirely unintended consequence of making Edo one of the largest and most economically active cities in the world by the 1700s, as the permanent presence of hundreds of daimyo households and their enormous retinues created a consuming market that merchants from across the country organized themselves to serve. The rigid social order that the Tokugawa system maintained divided the population into four officially recognized tiers: samurai at the top, then farmers, then artisan, then merchants, with additional groups existing in conditions of severe legal and social restriction below all four categories. The samurai class, composing somewhere between 6 and 8% of the total population, lived on hereditary stipends paid in rice by their domain lords, wore two swords as the visible and legally enforced marker of their status, and were governed by behavioral expectations that distinguished them from every other social category in ways that were theoretically permanent and practically increasingly complicated as the decades of peace accumulated. The world inside the Tokugawa order was rigid in its official structure and extraordinarily rich in its unofficial life. Kabuki theatre, with its elaborate costumes and dramatic stories drawn from samurai history and contemporary urban scandal, developed in Edo and Osaka as a commoner entertainment form and became enormously popular across all social classes who could find a way to attend. Woodblock printing made visual art affordable and widely distributed, carrying images of actors, landscapes, and the life of the entertainment districts to audiences across the country, and eventually, after Japan opened in the 19th century, across the world. The great merchant houses of Osaka accumulated fortunes that dwarfed the stipends of most samurai families and exceeded the operating budgets of many domain governments, creating the quietly absurd situation of men who were officially ranked below farmers, lending money to lords who technically outranked them and could not comfortably afford to repay it. The culture of the townspeople, the chonin, generated its own aesthetic world, its own literary forms, its own theatre, its own cuisine, with a creative energy that the official social hierarchy would have predicted from the top of the order rather than from near the bottom. Edo developed its own version of sushi during this period. The hand formed rice and fish preparations that street vendors sold from stalls along the canals. Practical and affordable, and entirely different from the fermented rice preparations of earlier centuries. Soba noodles made from buckwheat flour became a staple of the urban diet. Tempura, vegetables and seafood coated in light batter and fried in oil, spread through the street food culture of the cities, its technique possibly carrying traces of Portuguese cooking methods, introduced during the brief period of contact before the national seclusion edicts closed Japan to most foreign influence. The contradictions embedded in the Tokugawa system deepened as the peace extended across generations, pressing against the rigid categories from inside with the patient and irresistible force of economic reality. The categories remained formally intact while the reality inside them shifted constantly, and the distance between what the system claimed to be and what it actually was grew wider, with every decade that passed without a war to remind everyone which end of the social hierarchy held the swords. On the 8th day of the 7th month of 1853, 4 warships entered Edo Bay and anchored within sight of the shore close enough that the people standing on the beach could see the details of the vessels with uncomfortable clarity. 2 of the 4 were steamships, powered by technology that Japan had not developed and had not been permitted to acquire during the 2.5 centuries of national seclusion, and they moved without sails through the water in a way that observers on the shore found profoundly and viscerally unsettling, in the manner that things which violate the basic assumptions of your understanding of the physical world tend to be unsettling. The ships were painted black, and the phrase that attached itself to them in the Japanese language, kurofune, black ships, carried an atmosphere of dread that the literal description barely begins to capture. Their commander was Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy, and he carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore requesting that Japan open its ports to American vessels for trade and resupply, grant fair treatment to American sailors who found themselves on Japanese shores, and establish the framework of a normal diplomatic relationship between the two countries. Perry made clear through his manner, his heavily armed fleet, and his explicit statements that he expected a substantive answer and that he would return the following year to receive one. He was not making a request in the sense that the word implies optionality. He was delivering an ultimatum wrapped in diplomatic language, thin enough that nobody who received it had any difficulty seeing through to the substance beneath. The shogunate's response to Perry's arrival revealed in concentrated and painful form the vulnerabilities that 2.5 centuries of internal peace and deliberate isolation had allowed to accumulate beneath the apparently stable surface of the Tokugawa order. The coastal defences around Edo Bay were wholly inadequate against steam, powered warships carrying modern artillery, and everyone who examined them with honest eyes understood this immediately. The Tokugawa government had no navy of any meaningful consequence and no military technology capable of compelling the American ships to leave. The political leadership was divided between those who recognized that some accommodation with Western powers was unavoidable and those who found the idea of any accommodation intolerable, regardless of the military realities that made resistance impossible. The shogunate did something it had rarely needed to do in its 2 centuries of confident governance. It consulted the imperial court in Kyoto and circulated the question of how to respond among the domain lords across the country, an admission of uncertainty so public and so unprecedented that it undermined the shogunate's own authority by demonstrating that the decision was too large and too consequential for the central government to make alone. Perry returned in February of 1850, with a larger fleet than he had brought the previous year, and received the Convention of Kanagawa, which opened 2 Japanese ports to American ships and established a resident American consul on Japanese soil for the first time. The Harris Treaty of 1858 went considerably further, opening additional ports to trade, establishing extraterritorial legal rights for American citizens in Japan that placed them outside Japanese legal jurisdiction, and setting tariff rates at levels that Japan had no power to negotiate or control. Similar agreements followed rapidly with Britain, France, Russia, and the Netherlands, each one extracting concessions that reflected the fundamental imbalance of military and industrial power between Japan and the Western nations, pressing these arrangements. The treaties were signed under conditions that left minimal room for genuine negotiation, and they were immediately and deeply controversial within Japan in ways that cut across the domain boundaries and social categories of the Tokugawa order, generating opposition among groups that had almost nothing else in common beyond their conviction that what was happening was an unacceptable humiliation that demanded a response. The political movement that crystallized in opposition to the shogunate's handling of the foreign crisis organized around the slogan Sono Joi, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians, a phrase that combined two ideas of limited practical compatibility with each other into one formulation of extraordinary emotional and political power. Reverence for the emperor implied that the shogunate, which had governed in the emperor's name for over 2.5 centuries while keeping the imperial institution in careful ceremonial isolation, was an illegitimate intermediary standing between the Japanese people and their true sovereign. Expelling the barbarians was a demand that the shogunate's entire foreign policy approach be reversed, which the shogunate's own most capable advisers understood was militarily impossible, but which resonated with enormous force among those who had not examined the military balance honestly, or who had examined it and decided that the humiliation of accommodation was worse than the consequences of resistance. Naosuke, the senior Tokugawa official who signed the Harris Treaty in 1850, and then attempted to suppress the political opposition it generated through a series of arrests and executions known as the Ansei Purge, was assassinated outside the shogunate's Edo castle in the 3rd month of 1860 by a group of warriors from the Mito domain acting in the name of the Sono Jokars. The killing of the shogunate's most powerful official in front of his own headquarters by men who had walked through the snow to do it demonstrated with terrible clarity that the political order was under genuine physical threat, that the mechanisms of Tokugawa authority were no longer capable of protecting even their own senior leadership without restriction. The domains of Choshu in western Honshu and Satsuma in southern Kyushu became the centers of anti-shogunate activity across the following years, and both had particular historical reasons for their intensity. Both were powerful domains whose ruling families had been on the losing side at Sekigahara in 1600 and had spent over 2 centuries under Tokugawa arrangements, specifically designed to limit their ability to accumulate the kind of power that might translate into a challenge to the central government. They had long memories, and they had been paying attention to developments in military technology with a seriousness and speed that the shogunate had not matched. Choshu domain began training mixed class rifle units that included commoners alongside samurai, armed with modern firearms purchased through the limited foreign trade channels available, units that contradicted the social principles of the Tokugawa order but produced a demonstrably more effective military force than tradition. Bound samurai units, equipped with older weapons and organized according to assumptions about warfare that the mid-19th century had comprehensively overtaken. The shogunate's own military expedition against Choshu in 1866 collapsed when Satsuma, which the shogunate had expected to participate in the punitive campaign, instead remained neutral under the terms of a secret alliance it had been negotiating with its former rival, the Satsuma-Choshu alliance, brokered through the remarkable political skill of an operator named Sakamoto Ryoma, who understood that the two domains' shared interest in ending Tokugawa rule outweighed their considerable mutual suspicions, gave the anti-shogunate movement the military foundation it had previously lacked, and changed the balance of the coming confrontation in ways that everyone involved understood were irreversible. When the last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, formally returned governing authority to the imperial throne in the 12th month of 1867. The act was framed as a voluntary restoration of legitimate imperial rule, but was conducted under the very clear understanding that the military situation and the political coalition arrayed against him left limited alternatives that a man of his intelligence could honestly prefer. The imperial restoration announced on the 3rd day of the 1st month of 1868 declared the resumption of direct imperial rule under the young Emperor Meiji, who was 15 years old and around whom the coalition of Satsuma and Choshu samurai, corps noble, and reform-minded officials who had engineered the transition would now build something Japan had never quite had before. The Boshin War that followed ran through 1868 and into 1869, fought between imperial forces moving northward and the Tokugawa, aligned domains that had not accepted the restoration, and it ended with the extinction of organized resistance at Hakodate in the northern island of Hokkaido in the 5th month of 1869. The domain system was abolished in 1870. 1. Replacing over 200 semi-autonomous daimyo territories with centrally administered prefectures governed by officials appointed by and accountable to the new central government in Tokyo, as Edo had been renamed. The Conscription Ordinance of 1870. 3. Established a national army built on universal male military service rather than hereditary warrior status, explicitly stating that the old distinction between warrior and commoner in military matters was abolished. The Hato Edict of 1870. 6. Prohibited the wearing of swords in public, removing at a stroke the most visible legal marker of samurai identity that had distinguished a warrior from every other person on a public street for centuries. A class that had defined the political and social structure of Japan for 700 years had been legally dissolved in less than a decade, with a speed and completeness that left almost no institutional trace of what had stood before. Saigo Takamori was in many respects the person most responsible for creating the world that ultimately destroyed him, which is a particular kind of tragedy that history reserves for its most consequential figures. He had been central to the Satsuma Choshu alliance that made the Meiji Restoration possible. He had negotiated the peaceful surrender of Edo Castle that prevented the Boshin War from becoming significantly more destructive and more bitter than it was, saving the city that would become Tokyo from the kind of siege that leaves physical and psychological ruins lasting generations. He had served in the early Meiji government as one of its most senior military figures, a man of enormous personal authority whose support for the new order had lent it a legitimacy among the warrior class that no document or imperial proclamation could have generated on its own. He was large by the physical standards of his era, personally commanding in a way that went beyond mere size, and regarded by those around him with a mixture of genuine admiration and very careful attention. By the early 1870s, he was deeply uncomfortable with the direction Japan's transformation was taking, not because he opposed modernization as a principle or wanted to preserve the Tokugawa order that the Restoration had dismantled, but because the specific human cost of the changes, particularly the cost borne by the samurai class that had made the entire transition possible, struck him as a form of institutional ingratitude being conducted with too much administrative efficiency and too little acknowledgement of what was being taken and from whom. The break came in 1870. 3. Over a debate about Korea in which Saigo proposed sending a mission that he apparently expected would provoke a violent response and thereby provide justification for military intervention, an approach that the officials who had just returned from 2 years observing Western industrial and military capacity argued forcefully against, on the grounds that Japan was not yet strong enough to risk a foreign war that might draw in larger powers. The debate was resolved against Saigo's position, and he resigned from the government and returned to his home domain of Satsuma, where he established a network of private military academies, training young men in martial skills while the stipends were being cut, the swords were being prohibited, and the world those young men had been raised to inhabit was being systematically and irreversibly dismantled around them. In the first month of 1870, 7. Students from Saigo's academies raided government arms depots around Kagoshima, apparently acting on the belief that the central government was preparing to move against Saigo and his network before he could become the focal point of organized resistance. Saigo, presented with a situation that had developed without his direct initiation, but around his name and his example, chose to lead the resulting rebellion rather than abandon the men who had organized themselves in his image. Whether he believed the rebellion could succeed militarily is a question that the historical record does not answer with certainty, and several accounts suggest he understood the odds with a clarity that was complete and unsparing, and chose to go forward anyway, which would make his decision less a military calculation than a statement about what his life had meant and what he was prepared to do in its defense. The Satsuma Rebellion began with a force of somewhere between 15,000 and 30,000 men. Many of them experienced warriors trained in both traditional and modern military methods, moving north from Kagoshima toward the government garrison at Kumamoto Castle. The castle was held by a government force of conscript troops whose quality the Satsuma leadership had assessed as inadequate to resist experienced samurai fighters, and the expectation was that it would fall quickly and that the rebellion's early momentum would attract wider support from other disaffected former samurai across Kyushu and beyond. The castle did not fall. The garrison under its commander held through a siege of 54 days, enduring severe shortages of food and ammunition. While government relief forces made their way south along routes that the rebellion had not been able to close, the conscript soldiers defending Kumamoto performed with a discipline and steadiness under sustained pressure that directly contradicted the Satsuma leadership's assessment of what men without samurai backgrounds and hereditary warrior training could be expected to do when the situation became genuinely difficult. It was the Meiji government's conscript army, demonstrating in the most direct way available exactly why it had been created, and exactly what the abolition of the old warrior class monopoly on military service had been designed to produce. Once government relief columns broke through to Kumamoto Castle in the middle of the spring of 1877, the strategic situation shifted with a decisiveness that left no realistic path to a different outcome. The Meiji government deployed its national army with a scale, an organizational capacity, and a logistical sophistication that the rebellion simply could not match, regardless of the individual quality of the fighters it could put in the field. The government eventually assembled a force of over 60,000 men supported by artillery, modern rifles, naval gunfire from warships operating along the Kyushu coast, and a supply apparatus capable of sustaining a prolonged campaign across difficult terrain without the shortages that were steadily reducing the Satsuma forces' effectiveness. The battles across Kyushu through the spring and summer of 1877 gradually reduced the rebellion in numbers and territorial control. The fighting retreat southward, marking each stage of a contraction that everyone involved could see was moving in only one direction. The combat at Tabaruzaka in late winter had been fierce and costly on both sides, demonstrating that the Satsuma warriors were formidable opponents in close quarters, fighting even against numerically superior forces with better weapons and more ammunition. But individual martial excellence and the courage that the warrior tradition had always claimed as its defining virtue could not compensate indefinitely for the mathematical realities of a prolonged campaign against an opponent with virtually unlimited capacity to replace casualties and resupply. Position. By the 9th month of 1877, Saigo's entire remaining force had been reduced to somewhere between 300 and 500 men occupying Shiroyama, a hill overlooking the city of Kagoshima, surrounded on every side by a government army of several thousand soldiers and warships in the bay below, whose guns covered the approaches that the land forces did not. The government commander sent Saigo a message offering terms, a gesture whose generosity under the circumstances reflected something about how even his enemies regarded the man they were surrounding. Saigo did not reply. The final assault came before dawn on the 24th day of the 9th month, government forces moving uphill from multiple directions through the darkness. And by the time full daylight came to Shiroyama, the battle was finished, and the last significant armed resistance of the samurai class to the new order had ended on a hillside above the city where the rebellion had begun. The government buried Saigo with appropriate ceremony, formally pardoned him in 1889, when the Meiji Constitution was promulgated, and erected his statue in Ueno Park in Tokyo, where it still stands. A former rebel in bronze, overlooking the capital he had helped create and then fought against, his rebellion was incorporated into the national story not as a dangerous insurrection that had been suppressed, but as a tragedy that had been necessary. The painful and inevitable conclusion of a noble tradition making way for something Japan needed urgently to become. The samurai as a legal category was gone. What proved impossible to legislate away was the image, the vocabulary, and the aesthetic framework the tradition had generated across 7 centuries, which proved more durable than any of the institutions that had housed them. Nitobe Inazo's book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan, published in 1900 and written originally in English for a Western audience, shaped how the world understood Japanese culture and simultaneously reinforced within Japan the idea that Bushido represented a coherent and ancient ethical code that expressed the deepest character of the Japanese people. The Meiji military incorporated samurai aesthetics thoroughly into its officer culture, with consequences that deepened through the 1930s and 40s until the language of warrior sacrifice was being applied to strategic situations of absolute extremity, to young men flying aircraft into warships while their country told them they were the divine wind given human form. The defeat of 1945 and the American occupation that followed created a complicated reckoning with that inheritance, restricting martial arts and period dramas initially before the restrictions lifted and the samurai returned to Japanese screens in a different register, less nationalist than human, less ideological than personal. Akira Kurosawa became the figure most responsible for translating samurai culture into cinematic language that resonated globally. With Seven Samurai in 1950, 4 following warriors who were exhausted and pragmatic, and defined by the gap between what warriors are supposed to be and what they actually are. A film that influenced generations of filmmakers across the world and established the template for a kind of storytelling that has never entirely gone away. The martial arts descended from samurai practice survive in dojos and school gymnasiums across Japan and across the world, carrying within their forms a genuine physical connection to the tradition, even with the combat application largely removed. The castles remain on their hills. The tea ceremony continues in its quiet rooms. The katana rests in museum cases, a tool of violence that became an object of beauty, made by craftsmen for warriors and now contemplated by people who may never have held a weapon of any kind. The distance between what it was made for and what it has become, measuring the same distance the samurai themselves crossed across 1,000 years of loyalty, conflict, beauty, and irreversible change.